Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. Imagine a garden lit by candles tied to the backs of wandering tortoises, where thousands of tulips bloom under a moonlit sky. This was the paradise of Sultan Ahmed III. But beyond the perfumed walls of his palaces, a city was starving. This is the story of a sultan who gave his empire an age of unparalleled beauty, only to be devoured by the very people he ruled, a tale of opulence, rebellion, and a throne lost in a storm of fire and blood. In the heart of the sprawling Topkapi Palace, a world unto itself, there existed a place of exquisite beauty and profound terror, the Kafes, the Gilded Cage. This was not a prison of iron bars, but one of silk, marble, and gold. It was here that Prince Ahmed, son of Sultan Mehmed IV, spent 3 decades of his life. From the age of 6, following the deposition of his father, this opulent prison was his entire universe. The Kafes was the Ottoman dynasty's brutal solution to the fratricide that had stained its history. Instead of executing rival princes, they were confined, kept alive but neutered, cut off from the world and the levers of power. Ahmed grew to manhood surrounded by deaf-mute servants, concubines chosen for their lack of ambition, and the ghosts of his relatives. He could hear the echoes of the empire outside his lavishly tiled walls, but he could not touch it. He learned calligraphy, poetry, and the arts, his mind a repository of culture, while his understanding of statecraft remained purely theoretical. Every day was a lesson in survival. The rustle of a curtain, an unfamiliar footstep in the corridor, any could signal his end. He saw his brother, Suleyman II, and his uncle, Ahmed II, taken from the Kafes to rule, only to die after short, troubled reigns. He then watched as his other brother, Mustafa II, ascended the throne. For 30 years, Ahmed lived on a knife's edge, a pawn in a game whose rules he could not influence. This prolonged isolation forged a unique character, a man of refined taste and deep paranoia, a patient observer with a profound detachment from the raw, brutal mechanics of power. He was a scholar, an artist, a prisoner waiting for a destiny he both craved and feared. The year 1703 was a year of fire and fury. The empire was teetering on the brink. The long, disastrous Great Turkish War had ended just 4 years prior with the Treaty of Karlowitz, a humiliation that saw the Ottomans cede vast territories in Europe for the first time. The treasury was empty, the soldiers were unpaid, and the people were starving. The reigning sultan, Ahmed's brother Mustafa II, had retreated to his palace in Edirne, far from the turbulent capital of Istanbul, lost in the pleasures of the hunt. This disconnect would be his undoing. A mutiny began amongst the janissaries in the capital, a spark that ignited a wildfire of popular discontent. Known as the Edirne Incident, it was a full-blown revolution. Tens of thousands of soldiers, clerics, merchants, and common citizens marched on the old capital, their rage directed at a distant sultan and his corrupt advisors. Their demand was simple: abdication or death. Mustafa II, cornered and abandoned by his loyalists, had no choice. He was deposed. The leaders of the rebellion now needed a new sultan, a puppet they believed they could control. Their choice fell upon the forgotten prince in the Kafes. After 30 years of confinement, the doors to Ahmed's cage were thrown open. He was not met with a glorious procession, but with the menacing faces of the rebels who had just overthrown his brother. They did not bow, they dictated terms. Ahmed III ascended to a throne that was not won, but given. A throne stained with the threat of blood and built upon the ashes of his brother's reign. His first challenge was not to rule, but simply to survive the very men who had made him sultan. He had to navigate a viper's nest of court intrigue and military insubordination, all while projecting an authority he had never been allowed to cultivate. While Ahmed III struggled to consolidate his fragile grip on power in Istanbul, a storm of immense proportions was raging in the north. This was the Great Northern War, a conflict that was reshaping the map of Europe and forging a new, terrifying power on the Ottoman frontier, the Russian Empire. At its heart was a man of titanic ambition and brutal energy, Tsar Peter the Great. Peter was a force of nature, a monarch obsessed with dragging his vast medieval kingdom into the modern age. He was building a new capital, St. Petersburg, on the Baltic coast, a window to the west, and constructing a formidable European-style army and navy from scratch. His vision was not limited to the north. Peter's gaze was increasingly turning south, towards the warm waters of the Black Sea, the breadbasket of Ukraine, and the heartlands of the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, the Ottomans had viewed the Tsardom of Muscovy as a secondary power, a distant and manageable threat. But Peter's Russia was something new, something far more dangerous. His capture of the Ottoman fortress of Azov years earlier had been a shocking wake-up call. Now, his war against the Swedish Empire and its warrior king, Charles XII, was the central drama of European politics. In the court of Ahmed III, the news from the north was received with a mix of alarm and strategic calculation. The Sultan's advisors were divided. Some saw Russia's rise as an existential threat that must be confronted immediately. Others saw the war as a welcome distraction, a chance for the Ottomans to recover and rebuild while two of their rivals bled each other dry. But the conflict would not remain distant for long. The fate of this northern war was about to come crashing down on the Ottoman doorstep, forcing Sultan Ahmed III to confront the formidable shadow of Peter the Great. In 1709, the decisive Battle of Poltava shattered the Swedish army and the myth of its king's invincibility. Charles XII, wounded and defeated, fled south with the remnants of his forces, seeking refuge within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. His arrival turned him from a distant monarch into a highly influential and highly problematic guest of Sultan Ahmed III. From his camp at Bender, Charles relentlessly agitated for an Ottoman war against his nemesis, Peter the Great. He became the focal point for the war party in Istanbul, promising a Swedish alliance and sweetening his arguments with borrowed gold. For 2 years, Ahmed's court was a hotbed of diplomacy and intrigue. Peter's ambassadors offered peace and trade, while Charles and the Crimean Khan promised a holy war to reclaim lost lands and crush the rising Russian threat. Finally, in 1710, influenced by his pro-war mother and the Grand Vizier Baltakar Mehmed Pasha, Ahmed III declared war. An immense Ottoman army, one of the largest assembled in decades, marched north. In the summer of 1711, on the banks of the Pruth River in modern-day Moldova, they cornered their prey. Through brilliant maneuvering, Baltakar Mehmed Pasha completely encircled Peter the Great's entire army. The Tsar, along with his future wife Catherine, and the entire command structure of the Russian Empire, was trapped. With their supply lines cut and facing annihilation from superior Ottoman artillery, their situation was hopeless. Peter the Great, the modernizer, the conqueror of Sweden, was on the verge of total, abject defeat. He sent desperate pleas for a truce, ready to concede almost anything to avoid capture. The fate of Russia now lay entirely in the hands of the Ottoman Sultan and his Grand Vizier. The year is 1718. In the Serbian town of Požarevac, known to the Ottomans as Pasarowitz, the ink dries on a document that is more than a treaty. It is a reckoning. For Sultan Ahmed III, this is the bitter fruit of a disastrous war against Austria and Venice. The taste of his earlier victory against Peter the Great's Russia has turned to ash in his mouth. The terms are brutal, a litany of imperial humiliation. The mighty fortress of Belgrade, the gateway to the Balkans, is surrendered. So too are the Banat of Temeswar and large swathes of Serbia and Wallachia. The empire, which for centuries had known only expansion into Europe, was now in forced, undeniable retreat. This was not merely a loss of territory, it was a profound psychological shock. The myth of Ottoman invincibility, already cracked, was now shattered. For the Sultan and his court, The Treaty of Passarowitz was a cold, hard lesson in the new realities of power. The Habsburgs, with their disciplined armies and superior artillery, were not the foes of old. The world had changed, and the empire had failed to change with it. In the gilded halls of Topkapi Palace, a grim silence must have fallen. The age of the Ghazi, the warrior sultan leading armies to glorious conquest, was over. A new path had to be forged, not out of desire, but out of necessity. If the sword could no longer guarantee the empire's future, then perhaps the mind could. The defeat forced a painful introspection. It was a moment of crisis that would, paradoxically, give birth to an era of unprecedented cultural brilliance. Ahmed III, the defeated sultan, now had to preside over an empire that could no longer afford the grand ambitions of war. Its gaze would have to turn inward and westward, not for conquest, but for knowledge, for art, for a new way to be. Every great transformation requires an architect. For the new era dawning in the Ottoman Empire, that man was Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha. He was not a warrior. His genius lay not on the battlefield, but in the subtle arts of diplomacy, administration, and cultural patronage. When he was appointed Grand Vizier in 1718, shortly after the disaster at Passarowitz, he embodied the very shift the empire desperately needed. His connection to the Sultan was intimate and powerful. He was married to Ahmed III's daughter, Princess Fatma, earning him the title Damat, or son-in-law. This bond of family gave him an unparalleled level of trust and authority. Ibrahim Pasha understood the core lesson of the recent defeat. Brute force was no longer enough. The West, particularly France, was not just a military threat, but a cultural powerhouse whose secrets must be unlocked. He became the engine of this new policy. He slashed the military budget and redirected the vast state revenues towards domestic projects. His vision was to remake Istanbul into a city that could rival the capitals of Europe in its splendor and sophistication. He dispatched ambassadors, not just to negotiate treaties, but to observe, to learn, and to report back on everything from French palace architecture to courtly etiquette. He was a man of immense charm and intellect, a patron of poets and artists, but he was also a shrewd politician. He consolidated power, placing his allies in key positions and amassing a personal fortune that was legendary. While he cultivated peace abroad and fostered a cultural renaissance at home, his methods created a new, powerful elite that grew fabulously wealthy. Ibrahim Pasha was building a new world of refinement and luxury, but he was building it on a foundation of political patronage that bred both envy and resentment. He was the visionary of the Tulip Age, but in his brilliance lay the seeds of his own destruction. With the state's direction set by the Sultan and its execution in the hands of Ibrahim Pasha, a cultural fever began to grip the Ottoman elite. It was an age of novelty, a conscious turning away from the austerity of war towards the pursuit of beauty and pleasure. Though the name Lale Devri, the Tulip Age, would be coined much later, it perfectly captures the spirit of the time. The tulip, a flower long cherished by the Ottomans, became an obsession. It was more than a plant. It was a symbol of divine beauty, a fragile perfection that could be cultivated and possessed. Rare bulbs were traded for astronomical sums, their names, like the one that burns the heart or light of paradise, reflecting their precious status. Tulip festivals became the centerpiece of courtly life, but the cultural blossoming extended far beyond the garden. In 1727, a landmark event occurred, the establishment of the first printing press with movable Arabic type, run by Ibrahim Mutafarrika. It was a revolution in knowledge, publishing books on science, history, and geography, opening the Ottoman mind to new worlds of thought. Embassies returned from Vienna and Paris, not with spoils of war, but with sketches of gardens, blueprints of palaces, and descriptions of a different way of life. French Rococo and Baroque styles began to seep into Ottoman art and architecture, creating a unique, delicate fusion. Fountains, an obsession of Ahmed III, were built across Istanbul, their intricate designs reflecting this new aesthetic. poetry shifted its focus from epic tales of conquest to intimate verses celebrating wine, love, and the ephemeral beauty of the tulip. For the wealthy upper crust of Istanbul, it was a dazzling time of discovery and delight, a deliberate crafting of a sophisticated, peaceful identity. The empire was putting on new clothes, trading its armor for silk and its sword for a poet's pen. At the tip of the Golden Horn, amidst the sweet waters of the Kafes stream, the spirit of the Tulip Age was given physical form. Here, Sultan Ahmed III and Ibrahim Pasha built their masterpiece, the Sadabad Palace, the abode of felicity. This was not a fortress like Topkapi, designed to project power and intimidate rivals. Sadabad was a pleasure pavilion, a summer palace dedicated entirely to leisure, art, and the celebration of nature. It was the heart of the new court life. Designed with a clear European influence, particularly from Versailles and Fontainebleau, its central palace was surrounded by smaller pavilions, marble fountains, canals, and meticulously manicured gardens. It was a fantasy world, an earthly paradise built for the elite. Here, the court would gather for extravagant festivities that became the stuff of legend. The most famous were the nighttime tulip illuminations. Thousands of lanterns and candles would be placed throughout the gardens, their light reflecting in the canals and on the surfaces of countless mirrors. In a display of surreal whimsy, tortoises with candles fixed to their shells were set loose to wander among the flower beds, creating a slow-moving, magical river of light. Poets would recite verses, musicians would play, and the Sultan and his entourage would drift through this dreamscape, a world away from the grit and grime of ordinary Istanbul. Sadabad was the ultimate symbol of the era, its beauty, its creativity, its embrace of pleasure. But it was also a symbol of its fatal flaw. This paradise was exclusive. Its gates were closed to the common man, who could only hear whispers of the incredible extravagance within. As the elite celebrated in their candle-lit gardens, a dangerous resentment simmered in the city's coffeehouses and barracks. Sadabad was a beautiful dream, but one from which the rest of the empire was waking up to a harsh reality. While the gardens of Sadabad bloomed, a new and intoxicating scent drifted in from the west. For the first time in centuries, the Sublime Porte was not looking at Europe solely through the sights of a cannon. Sultan Ahmed III, guided by his visionary Grand Vizier, Damat Ibrahim Pasha, decided to look through a different lens, the eye of the diplomat. In 1720, an unprecedented mission was dispatched. Yirmiseki's Mehmed Çelebi was sent not as a conqueror, but as an observer to the court of Louis XV in Paris. His task was to absorb, to understand, and to report on the sources of French power and refinement. His detailed account, the Seferetnam, was a revelation. He wrote not of military formations, but of architecture, of botanical gardens, of the opera, of the curious social habits of French women. He described the palaces of Versailles and Fontainebleau with an almost breathless wonder. This was not the report of a rival, but of an enchanted student. The seeds of Western influence, carried back in these reports, began to sprout in the fertile soil of the Tulip Era's elite culture. Palaces and fountains began to echo French Baroque and Rococo styles. But the most revolutionary import was not an architectural blueprint, it was a machine. Ibrahim Muteferica, a Hungarian convert to Islam, championed a technology that had long been resisted by the Ottoman religious establishment and the powerful scribes' guilds, the movable type printing press. In 1727, with the Sultan's cautious approval and a fatwa permitting the printing of non-religious texts, the first Turkish-language press began its work. Dictionaries, histories, and scientific manuals slowly emerged from its plates. It was a hesitant dawn. The press was a mere trickle in a vast empire, yet it was a profound shift. Knowledge, once the exclusive domain of the hand copyist, could now be replicated. The whispers from the West were being given a voice, one that could not be easily silenced. The heart of the Tulip Era was not the throne room of Topkapi Palace, but the sprawling, dreamlike gardens of the newly built Sadabad, the abode of felicity. Here, on the shores of the Golden Horn, Ahmed III and his court created a world of unparalleled opulence, a fantasy realm dedicated to pleasure and aesthetic delight. The era's symbol was the tulip, but its soul was captured in the legendary nighttime festivals. As dusk fell over Constantinople, the gardens of Sadabad would transform. Thousands of coloured lanterns, intricate mirrors reflecting the moonlight, and vast aviaries filled with songbirds created a scene of pure enchantment. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and expensive perfumes. But the most iconic spectacle was one of sublime absurdity and beauty. Tortoises, dozens of them, were set loose to wander among the endless beds of prized tulips. Small lit candles were carefully fixed to their shells. Their slow, meandering paths created a constantly shifting constellation of lights on the garden floor, a silent, living ballet of fire. These were not celebrations of military victory, but of poetry, music, and fleeting beauty. The great poet Nedim, the voice of the age, captured its spirit in his verses, urging the elite to laugh, play, and enjoy the world. Life was to be savoured like a rare wine. This was a deliberate turning away from the harsh martial traditions of the past. The courtly ideal was no longer the grizzled warrior, but the refined gentleman, the connoisseur of art and verse. They held poetry contests instead of javelin tournaments. They debated the merits of a particular tulip bulb with more passion than they discussed provincial governance. In the soft glow of the tortoise lanterns, the Sultan and his court were blissfully unaware that beyond the garden walls, the world was not a poem, and the darkness was growing deeper. Every glittering palace, every imported tulip bulb, every silken cushion at Sadabad came at a price, and that price was not paid by the Sultan or his courtiers. It was extracted, coin by painful coin, from the ordinary people of the empire. While the elite pursued an aesthetic paradise, the streets of Constantinople and the villages of Anatolia faced a much harsher reality. Grand Vizier Damat Ibrahim Pasha, the architect of the Tulip Era's splendours, was also the architect of its crushing economic policies. To fund the ceaseless construction of kiosks, fountains, and summer palaces, and to pay for the extravagant festivals, he unleashed a wave of new taxes. These were not levies on land or trade alone, but creative and invasive taxes on almost every aspect of daily life, hitting the artisans, shopkeepers, and farmers who could least afford them. The state, desperate for revenue, also resorted to devaluing the currency. The silver content in the akçe was repeatedly reduced, triggering rampant inflation. The cost of bread, oil, and basic necessities spiraled upwards. A craftsman's daily wage, once sufficient, could barely feed his family. While the court poet Nedim wrote of wine and roses, the coffeehouses buzzed with angry whispers of corruption and injustice. The chasm between the rulers and the ruled had never been so vast or so visible. The sight of the Grand Vizier's carriage, racing between his many newly built mansions, became a symbol of arrogant excess. The people saw a government obsessed with its own pleasure, a sultan lost in his gardens, utterly deaf to the growing hunger and desperation of his subjects. The indulgence of the few was becoming an insupportable burden for the many. The foundations of the abode of felicity were laid not on stone, but on the simmering resentment of a populace pushed to its very limit. While the Ottoman elite were distracted by aesthetics, a storm was gathering on their eastern frontier. The collapse of the Safavid dynasty in Persia had created a power vacuum, an opportunity that Damat Ibrahim Pasha believed was too good to ignore. He envisioned a swift campaign, an easy seizure of Western Persian territories that would fill the state's coffers and bolster the regime's prestige. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The initial Ottoman advances into the Caucasus and modern-day Azerbaijan soon bogged down. What was meant to be a simple land grab turned into a grueling, expensive, and increasingly hopeless war. Worse still, Persia was not leaderless for long. A brilliant and ruthless military commander of Turkmen origin, Nader Koli Beg, the future Nader Shah, rose from the chaos. He began to reorganize the Persian armies, infusing them with a new discipline and ferocity. The tide of the war turned. Ottoman armies, poorly led and supplied, began to suffer a series of humiliating defeats. The city of Tabriz, a major prize, was taken and then lost. News of thousands of janissaries and provincial troops perishing on the arid plains of Persia trickled back to Constantinople. This news was poison. In the capital, the people and the soldiers contrasted the reports of military disaster with the endless festivities at court. Their sons and brothers were dying in a pointless war, while the Sultan and his vizier built fountains. The cost of the campaign further squeezed the economy, making the tax burden even more unbearable. The war shattered the last vestiges of respect for the regime. It exposed Ahmed III and Ibrahim Pasha not just as decadent, but as incompetent. They had failed in the most fundamental duty of an Ottoman sultan, to lead the forces of Islam to victory. The Persian quagmire became the final, unforgivable sin. It was the spark that would soon ignite the pyre of public fury. While the Bosphorus villas shimmered and the tulip gardens of the Sadabad Palace bloomed in a riot of impossible colour, a rot was spreading through the foundations of the Ottoman state. The Tulip Era, for all its cultural brilliance, was financed on a mountain of debt and economic fantasy. Grand Vizier Damat Ibrahim Pasha, the architect of this Gilded Age, was a master of aesthetics, but a reckless steward of the treasury. To fund the endless festivals, the construction of pleasure palaces, and the importation of European luxuries, he resorted to desperate measures. New, crushing taxes were levied on the essentials of life: coffee, tobacco, soap. The common man in the bazaar, the artisan in his workshop, felt the squeeze directly. Their meagre earnings were devalued almost overnight as the state, starved for silver, began debasing the currency. The akçe, the silver coin of the empire, became lighter, its silver content diluted, a metallic ghost of its former self. This was a betrayal the people could feel in the palms of their hands. The janissaries, the supposed guardians of the throne, were paid in these worthless coins, their wages perpetually in arrears. Their loyalty, once bought with silver and honour, now festered into resentment. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, the whispers began. They were murmurs of anger against the Frankish affectations of the elite, their decadent parties that mocked the piety of their ancestors. The ulama, the religious establishment, saw a moral decay, a turning away from tradition. The city was a powder keg of discontent, where the glitter of the court cast a dark shadow over the hungry streets. Every lavish firework display over the Golden Horn seemed to mock the cold hearths of the poor. The people were not just impoverished, they felt abandoned, their sultan and his vizier living in a different world, a fragile paradise built upon their suffering. From the steam-filled bathhouses and rowdy taverns of Galata, a voice began to rise above the murmur. It was not the voice of a pasha, a scholar, or a general. It belonged to a man of the streets, an Albanian named Halil. He was a man of many lives and few prospects. A former sailor who had served on the patrol ship Patrona, earning him the nickname he would carry into history. He had been a small-time merchant, a bathhouse attendant, a man who lived and breathed the struggles of Istanbul's underclass. Patrona Halil was not a polished orator, but he possessed something far more potent: raw, unvarnished charisma. He spoke the language of the dock workers, the unemployed soldiers, and the bankrupt shopkeepers. He did not speak of complex economic theories. He spoke of the price of bread, the arrogance of the perfumed courtiers, and the injustice of a vizier who built fountains while the people went thirsty. He was a physical embodiment of the city's rage. Rough, imposing, and fearless, he held court in the city's forgotten corners, transforming shared grievances into a coherent narrative of betrayal. He told the janissaries that their honour was being sold for worthless metal. He told the artisans that their guilds were being destroyed by foreign tastes and crippling taxes. He told the pious that their faith was being insulted by the wine-fueled parties of the elite. To the powerful, he was a nobody, a piece of human flotsam. But to the thousands who felt voiceless, he was a reflection of their own desperation. He was not a leader who descended from on high. He was a leader who emerged from the depths, a man who had nothing to lose and was therefore capable of risking everything. In him, the fragmented anger of an entire city found its focal point, its champion. The 28th of September, 1730, began like any other day in the sprawling metropolis of Istanbul. The court at Topkapi remained blissfully unaware, perhaps planning another poetry reading or a moonlit excursion on the Bosphorus. But in the heart of the old city, the kindling of rebellion was about to be lit. The location was not a palace or a barracks, but the public baths near the Bayezid Mosque. It was here that Patrona Halil chose to make his stand. With a small band of followers, perhaps no more than 20 men, he launched his revolution. Emerging from the steam and clamour of the hammam, they were a strange sight. A ragged procession, some barely dressed, their fury, their only armour. They did not carry gleaming swords or muskets, but instead hoisted bath towels onto poles, creating crude, defiant banners. They marched directly to the Grand Bazaar, the commercial heart of the empire. Their initial cries were not for the Sultan's head. They were precise, targeted, and brilliant in their political calculation. "Close your shops!" they roared, their voices echoing through the vaulted stone corridors. They called for the heads of the Grand Vizier Damat Ibrahim Pasha, the Grand Admiral, and other key figures of the Tulip Era regime. This was a direct appeal to the Esnaf, the guilds of merchants and artisans who were the backbone of the city's economy and its most organized civilian force. As they moved through the labyrinthine market, their ranks began to swell. A blacksmith left his forge, a weaver his loom, a shopkeeper his counter. The initial absurdity of the scene gave way to a terrifying momentum. This was no mere riot, it was an organized expression of popular will. The spark, struck in the humidity of a public bath, had landed on the dry tinder of the Grand Bazaar, and a fire was beginning to catch. Within hours, the fire had become an inferno. The small band of rebels had transformed into a furious river of humanity, thousands strong, flooding the streets of Istanbul. Their rage, once a low murmur, was now a deafening roar. The symbols of the Tulip Era's opulence became their targets. The magnificent villas and pleasure gardens of the wealthy elite, which lined the shores of the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus, were ransacked and put to the torch. Flames licked the night sky, casting a hellish glow over the city as a century of accumulated wealth and art went up in smoke. The mob was a composite of the empire's dispossessed, janissaries marching alongside artisans, religious students next to common labourers, all united by a shared sense of betrayal. They stormed the city's prisons, freeing inmates who eagerly joined their ranks. The forces of order melted away. The janissary corps, who should have been the Sultan's shield, either stood aside or actively joined the rebellion, their loyalty to their comrades in poverty overriding any duty to the throne. The ultimate destination was clear: the Topkapi Palace, the sacred heart of the empire, where Sultan Ahmed III was now a virtual prisoner. The mob surged towards the imperial gate, their torches casting flickering shadows on the ancient walls. Their demands echoed across the first courtyard: the immediate execution of the Grand Vizier and his closest allies. The Sultan, a man who had presided over an era of unprecedented elegance, was now besieged by his own people. The scent of tulips had been replaced by the stench of smoke and fury. A mob was at his gates, and the world he had so carefully constructed was burning down around him. The air in Istanbul was no longer scented with tulips. It reeked of smoke, sweat, and sedition. The mob, a roaring beast of disgruntled artisans, disillusioned janissaries, and the urban poor, had found its voice in the unlikeliest of figures: Patrona Halil, an Albanian bath attendant turned revolutionary. Their rage, simmering for years over military defeats, crippling taxes, and the perceived decadence of the court, now had a single target: the architect of the Tulip Era, Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha. From within the fortified walls of the Topkapi Palace, Sultan Ahmed III could hear the roar of the city. It was the sound of his world collapsing. His advisors were paralyzed by fear, his guardsmen wavering in their loyalty. The rebels were not just at the gates, they were the gatekeepers. Their demand was simple, brutal, and non-negotiable. The heads of the Grand Vizier, his two sons-in-law, and the captain of the navy. For Ahmed, this was not merely a political calculation, it was a profound personal torment. Ibrahim Pasha was more than his chief minister. He was his son-in-law, his confidant, the man who had helped him shape an era of unprecedented beauty and refinement. To sacrifice him was to sacrifice a part of himself, to admit that the entire project of his reign had been a fatal miscalculation. But the alternative was unthinkable. The storming of the palace, the slaughter of his family, the complete annihilation of the dynasty. For 2 days, the Sultan agonized. He paced the gilded halls that now felt like a cage. He prayed for a miracle that would not come. Finally, with the city on the verge of utter chaos, he made his choice. It was the grim calculus of kings. Ibrahim Pasha and the others were summoned. There were no trials, only tears and a quiet, dignified acceptance of fate. The executioner did his work in the dead of night. The bodies were then unceremoniously loaded onto a cart and pushed out of the imperial gate to the waiting mob. Ahmed hoped the blood of his closest friend would appease the beast. He was tragically mistaken. It had only whetted its appetite. The severed heads of Ibrahim Pasha and his allies were not trophies of victory for the rebels. They were proof of the Sultan's weakness. Patrona Halil, standing amidst the frenzied crowd, saw not the end of the conflict, but the beginning of his own ascent. He had made the Padishah, the shadow of God on earth, bend to the will of a mob. The Sultan's aura of invincibility was shattered, and in its place grew a chilling realization among the rebels. If they could demand the head of the Grand Vizier, why not the crown of the Sultan himself? The sacrifice had failed. The mob did not disperse. Instead, their numbers swelled, their confidence hardening into unshakable resolve. The initial grievances about taxes and extravagance had metastasized into a direct challenge to the throne. The leaders of the revolt, now the de facto rulers of the city, delivered their final ultimatum to the palace. It was carried not with the deference of subjects, but with the arrogance of conquerors. They no longer wanted scapegoats, they wanted regime change. The ulama, the clerical class, were coerced into issuing a fatwa, declaring that a sultan who had lost control of his realm, who had indulged in vice and innovation, and who had failed in his sacred duty to wage war against the infidel, could be legitimately deposed. For Ahmed III, this was the final devastating blow. He was utterly alone. His guards had joined the rebels. His government was decapitated. His religious legitimacy was revoked. He was a prisoner in his own home, the vastness of the Topkapi Palace shrinking into a claustrophobic trap. The choice presented to him was stark and stripped of all ceremony. Abdicate the throne in favor of his nephew, Mahmud, or face the same fate as his vizier. There would be no negotiation, no exile. It was the throne or his life, and the lives of his sons. The Tulip Sultan, the great patron of the arts and master of ceremonies, found his reign ending not with a flourish, but with the cold, sharp point of an ultimatum. The transfer of power was a funereal affair. On October 2nd, 1730, Ahmed III, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire for 27 years, performed his last act as Sultan. He walked solemnly to the apartments of his nephew, Mahmud, the man who had spent his entire life imprisoned within the palace walls, as was the custom. There, in the gilded quiet, the deposed monarch pledged his allegiance to the new one. He reportedly offered a piece of haunting advice. Do not trust treacherous viziers. Always go among your people and know their conditions. It was a lesson learned at the highest possible price. Then came the most tragic moment of all. After leading Mahmud I to the throne room to be acclaimed by the officers of the state, many of whom had orchestrated his own downfall, Ahmed was escorted away. He was not exiled, not executed, but returned. Returned to the Kafes, the cage, the opulent set of chambers within the palace harem reserved for princes who were a potential threat to the reigning sultan. It was the ultimate, cruelest irony. This was the very prison he had inhabited for years as a young man before ascending to the throne. He had escaped its confines to preside over one of the most vibrant cultural periods in Ottoman history, filling the capital with libraries, fountains, and gardens. He had tasted absolute power and the freedom of an empire. Now, his world had shrunk back to the familiar walls of his youth. But this was a different kind of imprisonment. Before, he had been a prince waiting for a destiny that might never come. Now, he was a king uncrowned, a living ghost haunting the palace, forced to listen to the sounds of a new administration, a new era being built upon the ruins of his own. The laughter from the gardens, the call to prayer, the distant roar of the city that had once adored and then rejected him, all of it would have filtered through the latticed windows of his cage, a constant, tormenting reminder of all he had achieved and all he had lost. The cycle was complete. The prince had left the cage to become a sultan, and the sultan had returned to the cage to die a prisoner. Ahmed III would spend the final 6 years of his life in the Kafes, a footnote in the reign of the man he placed on the throne. He died in 1736, a quiet end for a ruler whose time in power had been anything but. Outside his prison, the empire grappled with his complicated legacy. The revolutionary fervour that had deposed him quickly soured. Patrona Halil and his lieutenants, having tasted power, became tyrants themselves, terrorising Istanbul until the new Sultan, Mahmud I, consolidated his authority and had them all summarily executed. Order was restored, but the spirit of the Tulip Era was extinguished. The magnificent Sadabad Palace, the symbol of Ahmed's reign, was looted and burned by the mob. The printing press, that revolutionary tool of enlightenment, was shut down and would not reopen for decades. A wave of conservatism washed over the empire, viewing the art, poetry, and Western-inspired architecture of the previous era as sources of corruption and weakness. So, how is Ahmed III to be remembered? Is he the Tulip Sultan, the enlightened patron who fostered a brief, beautiful renaissance of culture, art, and intellectual curiosity? Is he the man who understood that the empire's future lay not just in conquest, but in embracing new ideas, symbolized by the first Ottoman embassy to Paris and the establishment of the printing press? Or is he the decadent, out-of-touch monarch who indulged in lavish parties while his armies were defeated on the frontier and his people starved? Was his reign a garden of earthly delights or a prelude to disaster? The truth, as always, lies in the uncomfortable space between. His legacy is one of both petals and blood. He demonstrated that the Ottoman Empire was capable of profound cultural innovation, but also revealed the deep, violent fault lines that ran just beneath its glittering surface. The Tulip Era stands as a testament to what might have been, a fleeting moment of beauty and openness, ultimately consumed by the very forces it failed to address. Ahmed III, the king who returned to his cage, remains a tragic symbol of a monarch caught between a brilliant past and an uncertain future.